All right, gang, we're going to go over a few topics from the quiz. A lot of people missed, or at least a fair proportion, so I want to kind of hit them in a very short video. So this isn't going to take too long, but we're going to go ahead and cover them. So one of the questions involved local variables, and then others involved class variables and instance variables. So we're just going to make an itty-bitty little class, right? And we're going to stick some variables in it. Then we're going to add a function. Oh, do you need the room? I'm sorry.
No, I just come in to check this.
Oh, you're going to go check to see why we're so cold. All righty.
It was set on 71 out there. Let's say Saturday, for instance. I don't know if you know about Saturday.
Yeah. All right, so here we got some variables, right? This one is a local variable. What does local variable mean? It means it's local to a function, local to a method, right? Local variables cannot be accessed from outside the class, right? If we have another class, or we have a main somewhere, and we're trying to, get a hold of v3, we're not going to be able to, unless it is returned, right? If it's returned, we can get that value out, right? That is the only way we would be able to get the value out of a local variable, is if you return it. There's absolutely no other way of getting it out. In C++, I can think of ways. In C# I can think of ways. But Java is what is known as a pass-by-reference or pass-by-copy. No, it's not a pass-by-reference. Java is not pass-by-reference. We'll go into what that means. It's pass-by-value or pass-by-copy. All right, let's go back up and talk about that. So that's a local variable because it's local to the function. It cannot be accessed outside of the function, outside of the method, right? If we have other methods inside the class, not going to be able to get to it. The client code is not going to be able to get to it unless it is being returned, in which case we get a copy of it and we can play with it. So this one is what's known as an instance variable. Whenever you see instance, think non-static because you leave off the static keyword. This one is a class variable. It is static. And if you are a C++ programmer, then those terms may seem a little bit different than how you used them in C++ in many occurrences, many examples. So why is one an instance variable and one a class variable? Well, because down in main, if you wanted to use, and I'm actually assuming that main is inside another class, right? Client code. Like that. If you want to get hold of v1, you have to create a new instance of it, right? A, my var equals new A. Now you can get a hold of v1, as long as it's not private, right? You can set my var.a equal to some value, right? That works because A is an instance variable, meaning you have to create an instance before you can access it. Now v2 is a static variable, meaning it's a class variable, meaning you access it through its class name, right? So we do not have to create an instance to get hold of v2. If we did, the Java compiler might flag it as a warning. Hey, why did you create an instance of it? Why are you trying? So, you would not use myvar.v2 to get a hold of the class variable. Instead, you just use the class name, right? So you'd use a.v2. Use equal to, 2, 3, 4, whatever. It's a class variable. So you access it with the class name. So for example, if we do this, I want to raise a number, int x is equal to, math.bow 3, 4. This is a class. It's not an instance. It'd be really annoying if we had to create a new instance of the math class every time we wanted to, use the math library. So they made all of the members of the math library static. They made them all class variables so that you can just call it from the class. Now, on the other hand, because the scanner class is a little bit more sophisticated and can work with files as well as, system.in, you do have to create a variable before you can call, next int, right? Right. So, mat.pow, class variable. So we accessed it via its class. Next int, next float, next long, dot next, dot has next int, all those members of the scanner class required an instance. So this is a class member. Member is just a super term for, variables and methods. And this is an instance member. Class members are declared as static. Instance members are not. Does that make sense?
Non-static, static.
Right. Yeah. Alrighty. Now what's this business about pass by reference? In some language, you can do this. You can define, I'm going to write a function or a method, and I'm going to make it void, and I'm going to call it change me, and it's going to accept a variable x, and I'm going to change its value. X is equal to 100, and now somewhere else in main or something, I could create another variable, and then I could call change me, and this is not the way Java works, so. And then if we printed out x, in those languages, you could jigger it so that it would print out 100.
Oh, I'm thinking static is when you put in the information. Is that correct?
Well, static just means that it applies to the entire class.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. In C, C++, you can consider it a kind of global variable because it exists outside of the class actually, and that's why you don't have to create an instance of it to access it. So that's all that static means. Okay, so in Java, this is what this code would do. It would pass in 3. It would pass in a copy. I don't know why I put a Python comment there. It would copy the value of x into here. Well, that was supposed to be a anyways, right? Because that variable is a. It would copy the value of a in here, and then it didn't matter. Even if we changed it to 100, it's still a 3 down here. If we had expected it to equal 100 here, too bad. There's no way to do that in Java. There's no way of declaring this as a reference. Unlike C++ or C#, where you could perhaps use pointers or reference variables, it just got a copy of it. So if you change it here, it doesn't change this original guy. Now if you pass in an array or a reference type like a string, it looks like it's passing a reference in. But for primitive data values, it's absolutely not. And for those types, it's really not passing in a reference either. It's just that the variable, if this is a class, like a string or something like that, then what gets copied into it is not the value of the string, the contents of the string, but the memory address of the string. And so if it makes any changes to it, it will work. But for primitive data types, it absolutely does not. And so that's the clearest illustration of it being passed by copy. If you wanted to get this value back out and store it into A, you could do this. You could say A is equal to that, and you could return it. That would fix it, right? Because although this is a local value, why am I calling it a local value? Because a parameter variable is local to that function. Then if we return it, he could use it. And I still say print x. Dadgummit. All right, there we go, like that. At this point, it's equal to 100 because we return that value, so it gets stored into there and we can make a change. So does that make sense? If you pass a variable in, you're not going to be able to change it and have it affect here. You can change it, you can do anything you want to in here, but it's just modifying the contents of a local variable. The parameter variable is a local variable, doesn't touch this. On the other hand, if you return the value, then you can do anything you want to.
Because that variable is only good inside that
Right, X is good in here.
But when you put it outside of there, then it means nothing. It's not even,
Right, the value doesn't get passed back
yeah,
unless you do that.
unless you put the return, yeah.
Right. Yeah, you got it.
If you don't put the return, then you do X outside of it means nothing. It means-
Yeah, exactly, right. I mean, it affects it for him. If we printed it out inside him,
Yeah.
it would print out 100.
We should
But
print it outside
down
of it.
here, it would
It's not
not.
good.
Exactly. So think of it as a mailbox. But you're not putting your original letter in it. You're making a photocopy of the letter and then sending it into the method. He can do anything he wants to with the photocopy of the letter. He can shred it or whatever. You have the original document.
Okay. So the only way to pass that into a new variable is to do what you just did. A equals change me, whatever.
Right. If you return it back, you can store that variable anywhere, even if you're just putting it back in the original value. Got it?
Okay.
Yeah. Alrighty. All right, so when you have variables that are declared as part of a class, regardless of whether they are instance variables or class variables, they get a default value, but that default value is always 0 or some permutation of it. Like if it's a reference variable, if it's a class variable, just if it's of type class, like a string, it defaults to null, which is an uninitialized variable. You can't do anything with it. But if it's a Boolean, if it's a primitive type, like an int or whatever, this one would default to 0. This one would default to 0. That makes sense. Now, a lot of people think Booleans default to 1. But it also defaults to 0, which is a false. Because ultimately, in electrical engineering terms, 0 means no current, meaning false. And 1 would mean that there is current, so it is true. So just remember that Booleans default to false. Unless you give it another value. And this only works for class members, instance members. If you actually do it inside a method, you better actually give it a value before you can use it. I don't know why they don't default these, to 0 or false inside a method, but they don't. So what is a class, or at least how does your professor recommend you think of it? You could Google up an answer, but ultimately it's a blueprint for something and something. It's a blueprint for a collection of variables, or you could call it data, or you could call it attributes, whatever. And the methods, some people would call them functions, but that would not be correct. Some people would call them behaviors, if you're thinking in an abstract term. So a class is a blueprint for a collection of variables and the methods that act upon those variables. Now, I guess they don't have to act on those variables. You could have a class with no variables. You could have a class with no methods. But fundamentally, just think of it like that, right? So, you have a triangle class. And what is a triangle class? It's got a couple variables representing the base and the height of the triangle. And then it's got some methods that use those variables or act upon those variables, right? Calculating the area or the perimeter or whatever. That kind of makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not sure, what did I put on there?
Sorry?
What did I put? I don't remember what I put on there. On the answer, on the test, I wasn't sure.
So if you need to turn like a string into an int or something like that, you just do this, right? Int I is equal to integer. You'd use the wrapper class. Parse int I. No, like s. Assuming s is a string, right? S is equal to 100 or 1, whatever, right? So this is the key. You want to turn a string into, convert a string to an int, you'd use the wrapper class. And if it was a double, you'd use double.parse double or whatever. What if you want to go the other way? You have another string. 2 ways you can do it. This is kind of the cheap, cheesy way, but it's by far the shortest way to type it. That's how I would do it. if I was in a hurry, but the test, if it asks a question about this, I don't recall, would use integer.toString, like that, to turn that integer into a string. So just remember, parse int converts it to an int, and toString takes it out of an int to a string.
What does the S2 do? The S string S2?
It's appending it.
Okay, so you add in.
Right, appending in Java will convert anything that follows a string automatically to a string. It does some kind of special thing, and I haven't figured out how the compiler does it, but anything after the plus sign calls either the toString method of the object, or if it's a primitive value, it just converts it. So very quickly that gets concatenated to that, and it just results in being 100 at that point. Weird way of doing it, but right, it only takes like 4 letters to type than that, so it's a quick and dirty way of doing it.
Okay, I get you. So those two are the same statement. That's just.
They do the exact same
Okay,
thing, right?
I get you.
Call this
One
a
same
cheap
thing.
hack, right? It's a quick way. Kind of obscure, but it works. This is, the canonical way, the book way. If the book asks, if the exam asks for it, if it's multiple choice, you would do that. If it's a fill in the blank, I don't care which of these ways you put.
Yeah, I get you. That's how you turn a string into.
This is how you convert an int
Right in.
to a string, right? Either way, and just ditto. Okay, so if the question asks how you get a hold of a piece of data that's defined as part of the class, you would want to make it public, right?
Yeah.
Public makes a variable accessible outside the class. Now, honestly, if you just leave out the default definition, if you just leave it like that, it's also available to classes, but only in the same package. Java supports a default which is available to the package, kind of like public to the package, but code outside the package couldn't get to it. The correct way to mark that you want to be able to use v1 like we did down here, I guess that was supposed to be v1 and not a. Hopefully that lecture made sense even though I didn't type v1. Students in here got it, so I trust that y'all did as well. All right, anyways, you mark these as public. Now, proper programming, book programming dictates that you actually set these to private and then you set your methods to public unless you have a strong reason otherwise. Now, in practice, when you're just writing a class as fast as possible, or if it's just something for holding data and you're not going to add any methods to it at all, whatever, and you can make the variables public, that's okay. These are not hard and fast rules that it cause the program to crash, but the paradigm that most people follow when writing textbook perfect classes is to make the data private.
I was thinking it was public automatically if you don't.
If you don't specify a type, it defaults to something very close to public. It defaults to a package level version of public, which means it is public but only available to other classes inside that same package. So if you then had to do an import of this class into something else, you couldn't get a hold of that data. Yeah. So just remember, data, private, methods, in general public, that's the textbook way of doing it. That's known as encapsulation. You're protecting the data from being modified outside the class. All right, there's a third way to convert data, but it's more specific. You can do some more advanced formatting, and that's to use string.format. Like what if we had a float and we wanted to print it out up to 5 decimal places? So you have a float, f equals 1 point, right? But you only want to print it out, or it's a double, whatever. String s4 is equal to string.format, and you use a placeholder. And you've seen these in printf statements as well. %f, comma, f. Let's change this variable name to something else. Since it's a double, I'm going to call it d, like that, right? But what if we wanted it to 4 decimal places? .4. And you've seen the same syntax with .printf. If you're a Python user, some of y'all are taking this simultaneously with Python, you'd use the same syntax, except you'd use a % sign there. That messes people up. Everybody who takes the Python exam, 1/3 of the people try to print it, put a comma there instead, because that's correct Java.
Yeah, I caught that. And I was like, oh, nope. At first I did the comma.
Right.
And I was like, oh, nope, it's the other.
Yeah. All right, not to flat out give the answer away. But what is this going to print? This involves references. What are we doing? We're creating a new monster, and the monster has a name. And then we create another new monster. But we didn't create a monster. This statement, ignoring the new monster bit, creates a reference, which can hold a memory address of the monster. This is the statement that actually goes out in memory and creates a monster object and then assigns its address to M1. If you're a C++ programmer, it's pretty close to being a pointer. Then we create another reference, but we set it equal to M1, meaning that they are now pointing to the same object. So if we set the name of monster1 to Sam, well, M2 is pointing to the same memory. It's like we have one house, but we have two street signs pointing to it. You paint the house red, it's going to be red no matter how many street signs are pointing to it. So does that make sense? If you set M2.name equal to Bob, it's not going to leave M1's name, Sam.
Because M2 equals M1.
Because M2 and M1 both have references to the same memory address. There's only one object. If we created two objects, M2 is equal to new monster and M1 dot monster, then each one has their own data. But right now they're sharing data because they're pointing to the same
So
object.
it would be Bob because it's the same thing,
Yeah,
right?
yep,
That's what I'm
exactly.
saying.
Yeah.
So in order to do Sam and Bob, I would need to do monster,
And then M2 equals new monster.
M2 equals new monster.
And then they have their own separate data. Now, if this data had been declared as static, then they're shared between the two, and it
It's very confusing.
would be Sam for both.
So,
But it's not
wrap
static.
my mind around that. So the M1.name, that wouldn't give you an error since that goes to, since it would be, wouldn't it be in, since it would display Bob, that wouldn't give you an error?
No, I don't see a syntax error in this. These are just two names for the same object.
I was thinking if you're calling M1.name, it would be, I guess because when you see, in the printf statement, when you do the M1.name, I guess you're actually calling M2?
Well, they're the same.
Because
Just
it's the
like
same.
two signs on the same house, two signs on the same store. They're both names of the store. You know, you could call, one side of it Quick Trip and the other side 7-Eleven, but it's the same store. And so if you paint the inside of the store red, then it doesn't matter which side of the store you're looking at. Whether you think it's called Quick Trip or 7-Eleven, it's still got a red floor.
Okay. See, I was thinking, when I was doing it, I was thinking, well, if you would call it M1, it would give you an error, so M1 would have to be Sam.
Yeah,
Since
there's-
M2 equals M1, I guess it doesn't matter if you call it M1 or M2?
Right, and there's no reason that would give an error because that's still perfectly good syntax. It's just that you have two references to the same object. Two pointers to the same object, two pointers to the same data, regardless of whether you call it M1.name or M2.name. It's perfectly fine. Now, almost nobody does this. However, there are times, like when you create arrays and stuff like that, that you may think that if you change a value or a member of the array, you just got to remember that it's just a reference to the original object, just like this one.
Okay. So if I did, in the printf, if I did M2.name, it would still just be Bob.
Right. They would both print out Bob, regardless of whether you printed out M1.name or M2.name.
So in order to do both Sam and Bob, I'd have to make the whole new monster.
Right, you'd have to make a whole new monster if you wanted to maintain these as separate pieces of data.
Okay, I got you.
And so just as a warning, if you added M1 to an array and then you change it via the array, then it's actually good, and then you try to print out M1, it would be different. Or if you change M1 after you add it to an array, then it would change the content inside the array because again, you just have two references to the same object. I kind of almost need to do a whole separate lecture on that.
Very confusing.
Not too confusing. You just have two things pointing to the same.
Then I get the array
Right.
part you're talking about.
But the array is just a series of references as well. So if this was an array and the first element of the array said, A0 equals M1, exactly the same situation. You have two references to the same object.
Okay. Yeah, so you would have to make.
So you'd have to make a new one if you wanted the array to be separate.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. So
Yeah.
you have array 1, and you have to have array 2 to do the same thing.
Right.
I got you.
What is that? Oh, that's my picture. What a weird icon. Is that a
It's like a cat that's flying around the windshield.
cat? Yeah. Alrighty. Alright, if you just want to swap two values like you have int x equals 3, y equals 4, and you wish those to be different, all you do is create a temporary variable. T is equal to x, and now you can erase x, right? And then you can set y back equal to t. That makes sense. That's not exactly a question, but that's how you swap two variables. Just create a temporary value. Right, it's just like you have, you know, an orange in one hand and an apple in one hand. If you hand the apple to somebody else, a temporary person, then you can put the orange in the other hand and you can grab the apple
That's
back.
reason, yeah, 'cause you, okay, so you have, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess I did something incorrect. A lot of times I don't know what the question's asking me.
And all right, gang, I kind of goofed on this question because the questions were sorted in random order. So in the diagram of the prior question, the hyphens in front of the member variables indicate they're declared. Well, you scroll up here, there is no diagram, right? So, anyways, yeah, that messes the question entirely up. So what I should say is in a UML diagram, the hyphens mean that they are private, right? And then plus signs in a UML diagram means that they're public. So I'm modifying that question, so if you do a retake, it'll specify that it's a UML diagram rather than saying, you know, quote in the prior diagram. I apologize for that. All right, so if you have an array, there's two ways of printing it out, right? If you declare an array like this, you could print the array out by its index for int I is equal to 0, I is less than 100, or ar.length, either one would work, I++, and then print out, it should be print line, right? System.out.println, ar subscript I, right? That's what you need to do. Arrays are accessed by subscripts. Now in this language, unlike C++, if you have an array list, the syntax is a little bit different. Same thing, right? So if we had an array list, int al, array list al, and then we have to specify the type, equals new array list, right? So now we have an array list, and let's say that we had added a bunch of items to it. I'm not going to add them for the example. Now when you want to print them out, you could do the same thing. For I is equal to 0, I is less than, you know, the length of it. We better actually check it, right? I++. Now you're not going to use square brackets to access it. Instead you're going to use .get, right? So print al.get subscript I. Except it's not a subscript, right? It's just an argument. Anyways, so you use square braces to get the data out of an array. You use the angles, you use the .get function to get it out of an array list. But there's one syntax which would handle both of them if you wanted, and that's the for each syntax. For int value in the array list, print the value out. And again, this should be system.out.println. Or for int value in the array list, print the value out, right? So you got two ways of printing out an array. You got two ways of printing out the array list, and conveniently the syntax for both of those, if you use a for each loop, is the same.
Okay, good. So dot get, you gotta do dot size.
Yeah, because if you use dot size, it would just print out 100 every time, or however many items were on the
Do
list.
dot get.
Yeah, so dot get gets it out.
So that's basically if you're doing user input.
Well, it doesn't matter whether it's input or not. Yeah. But that's a good point. How do you put the data in it? You use dot append, but how do you change the data? All right, so like you have an array list and you want to append a value to it. You could do that. But then what if you wanted to change that value? You would do al.set, right? And you would set the first value,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah. right, guys. If you want to upload some of your own notes there, just in case the library or somebody was complaining about you opening something from a Dropbox, just go and upload something to the assignments folder and it says student notes to use during exam. That makes it pretty clear that you're allowed to use, the stuff that you create. No, you cannot bring your paper in, right, but you can upload something there if you have some notes you want to upload. Alrighty, makes sense?
Yes, sir.
Alrighty.
Get it, got it, got